Vielen Dank. Thank you for coming. So, as you know, I'm here to talk with you today about the ecological turn in literary studies, which involves crossing the great divide between the humanities and the natural sciences. It involves new methods of investigation, new objects of inquiry, new terms and concepts, new associations and journals. And I'll be talking about the importance of this ecological turn in literary studies in relation to the emergence of the environmental humanities around the world. So, to begin with, I want to draw your attention to this article that was published in a special issue of Studies in Romanticism in 1996. This special issue was edited by Jonathan Bate, and it was entitled Green Romanticism. And Jonathan's own contribution to this special issue was entitled Living with the Weather. And in this article, he argues, I believe that we are now in a period of Kuhnian paradigm shift. It's a shift which could be described in a variety of ways. Perhaps a new geographism is replacing the new historicism. Or, to locate it in a wider context, Cold War criticism is dying. Global warming criticism is about to be born. Very timely that I should recall this article while the powers that be are debating reducing CO2 emissions in Paris. I'll point out that this article is based on a keynote lecture that Bate gave at the North American Association for the Study of Romanticism conference the year before, so exactly 20 years ago. Jonathan Bate was calling upon his colleagues in literary studies to pay attention to the grave problem of anthropogenic climate change. Well, the term global warming criticism, unfortunately, didn't really catch on at the time. But what Bate was referring to here was that in the criticism that had predominated in the previous decades, it was really all about human language, human creativity, human interests and agency, focusing on human social relations, psychological problems, etc. Whereas global warming criticism was to be focused on the dynamic interrelationship between culture and environment, recognizing also non-human as well as human interests, agency, and communicative capacity. So this was a whole new paradigm for literary studies. And it involved crossing the great divide. Now, I should say that Bate had already published a pioneering work of ecocriticism back in 1991, a book entitled Romantic Ecology, Wordsworth and the Environmental Tradition. That was 1991. But in his new work, he brought a philosophical sophistication to what he was terming a paradigm shift, drawing in particular on the work of the French philosopher Michel Serres, and his book The Natural Contract, published in French in 1990. This title refers to the theory of social contracts. Social contract theory goes back many centuries. A famous example is Jean-Jacques Rousseau's essay on the social contract, which played a role in the French Revolution. And the thing about this concept of the social contract was that it was a way of theorizing the way that individuals in a society are brought to, in a sense, conform themselves to the common good. And the trouble is, though, from Michel Serres' point of view, this common good, this contract, was exclusively human. So what he meant by the natural contract was that we needed a new understanding of ethics and politics that encompassed non-humans as well as humans. And Bate also drew on the work of Serres' student, Bruno Latour, and his book, We've Never Been Modern, French, 1991, in which Latour explores the concept that Serres introduces of the modern constitution. Latour explains the modern constitution as having created two entirely distinct ontological zones, that of human beings on the one hand, that of non-humans on the other. So two understandings of existence. There is a kind of tacit assumption that human existence is of a completely different order from that of the existence of animals and plants, for example. And this modern constitution with this ontological divide had implications for modern systems of knowledge which emerged in the 19th century, which severed the natural sciences from the human sciences, or the humanities as we call them in English. In German, the Naturwissenschaften from the Geisteswissenschaften. And the implication of this is once again that humans are somehow not part of nature, and that certainly the human mind, human culture is not somehow not natural, and that non-human nature is devoid of mind or spirit, something that anybody who's cohabited respectfully with a dog knows is rubbish. And, but this is really a kind of underlying structuring principle for our knowledge systems, and it has ethico-political implications as well. These were named by Australian eco-philosopher Val Plumwood as human chauvinism, by analogy with male chauvinism, feminist concept, or anthroparchy, as the British social theorist Erica Cudworth calls it, anthroparchy, again by analogy with patriarchy, systems of human domination, so the non-human world seen predominantly, not exclusively by any means, but predominantly in terms of mastery and possession. Should say that, of course, anthroparchy predates modernity, and it is not exclusive to Western culture, and indeed modernity in some ways challenges anthroparchy. But if you want to become aware of the persistence of this underlying structure of domination, just think about the contradictory practices that we have. The same person who pampers their pet may well eat factory farmed chicken. We have animals that we value as pets, and we have other animals that are treated as things. We have areas that we set aside as natural parks or wilderness areas, and other areas that become industrial wastelands. So, what does it mean then to cross the Great Divide in literary studies, to move beyond the modern constitution towards the natural contract, or perhaps one should better say the natural cultural contract? Well, what does Bate do in this article? He analyses and contextualises Byron's famous poem Darkness from 1816, which begins, "I had a dream which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished." And in this poetic thought experiment, he imagines what the consequence would be if sunlight no longer reached the earth. Well, plants would die. Everything that feeds on plants would die. Everything that feeds on the animals that feed on plants, as well as feeding on plants, would die, and that includes humans. And he explores the moral as well as the material implications of this blocking of the sunlight. So this poem has been read in a diversity of ways, mainly in relation to other texts, other cultural artifacts. But what does Bate do? He ponders that opening line. He takes it seriously. Byron writes, "I had a dream which was not all a dream," right? What's he telling us here? It's partially based on experience. So Bate thinks, okay, I'm going to go have a look at Byron's letters from this time. Sure enough, Byron divulges that it was a crappy summer on Lake Geneva where he was holidaying with his mates, the Shelleys. And so what does Bate do then? He does something that no literary scholar had ever done before with relation to this poem. He went and checked the meteorological records for the time. This is crossing the Great Divide. This is the new geographism. What was happening with the weather? Well, indeed, the meteorological records show that this was a summer without a summer, and the next year was pretty crappy too. So Bate then also looks at what are the impacts historically of these bad weather conditions, this global cooling, as in fact it was. Well, there were famines, there were food riots, it was a really bad time. And why? What was the cause of this global dimming? It was a supervolcanic eruption in Indonesia. The Tambora volcano erupted in April 1815, and it caused 2 years of global cooling. And so Bate recontextualizes this poem in relation to geography, not just other cultural artifacts. And focusing on the weather, which is referred to as an open dissipative system. It is a dynamic system such as you read about in chaos theory. It's a very, very complex system. When we think about the weather, when we read chaos theory, we realize that nature is not stable. And the weather is the primary sign of its mutability, Bate writes. But so too is the weather the primary sign of the inextricability of culture and nature. So if culture and nature are inextricable, literary studies that ignores the ecological consequences and contexts of literary works is woefully inadequate. So just to give you some examples of recent works that follow up on Bates' lead here. Just last year, Gillan Darcy Wood, happens to be another Australian, although working in the States, published a book that explores all of the complex ramifications of this volcanic eruption, economic, ecological, in terms of health. It was connected with the cholera outbreak that spread across the world, and cultural. I, in my book that's already been mentioned, look at a number of different kinds of so-called natural disasters, reading them in their environmental historical context and looking at a series of literary texts that reveal the complexity of these phenomena, that reveal, in fact, that the category of natural disaster belongs to the modern constitution and is in fact a misnomer. Why? Well, I frame the term ecocatastrophe in order to better capture the reality that there is no such thing as a purely natural disaster, that all such disasters spring from the nexus where environment, society and technology come together. Moreover, the kinds of disasters which are now increasing in frequency and intensity around the world, particularly weatherborne disasters, which are related to anthropogenic climate change, should be seen as sentinel events, wake-up calls, warning calls, sentinel events of processes that are intensifying on a planetary scale. And as Oliver Smith writes in Catastrophe and Culture, the interpretation of the messages brought by these sentinels remains a crucial issue. So we can look at literature as a space within which such messages, such events are interpreted and reinterpreted. So as well as involving new methodologies, and I could talk much more about that, ecocriticism gives rise to the study of genres of literature which had not conventionally been examined within literary studies. For example, another landmark book of ecocriticism in America was Lawrence Buell's The Environmental Imagination of 1995, which looks at non-fictional lyrical writing about place. He calls it nature writing. I think that's a problematic term for the reasons that I've just been outlining, but this term caught on. And so Thoreau is a canonical author. He has been studied, in literary studies, but not quite in the way that Buell studies him. But Buell also contributes to the revaluing of other authors writing in this mode who hadn't been considered before particularly, such as John Muir and Annie Dillard. More recently, Rob Nixon, in his Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, which came out in 2011, focuses on what he calls writer activists. Now, some of these, such as Indra Sinha from India, do actually write novels. He wrote a novel about the Bhopal disaster called Animals, People. But he also talks about the memoirs, the reportage, the essays of people like the Kenyan Wangari Maathai or the Nigerian Ken Saro-Wiwa. And to give another example, Adam Trexler this year has published a book called Anthropocene Fictions, the novel in a time of climate change, which focuses on the newly defined genre of cli-fi, right? Sci-fi, cli-fi, climate change fiction. He, together with Adeline Johns-Putra in England, had surveyed over 150 novels, and he writes about this in this book. Now, many of these novels would be considered below the concern of conventional literary scholars, Trivialliteratur, so the popular literature, as well as, more aesthetic works of fiction. So new genres are being studied, new terms and concepts. I've already mentioned some. The environmental imagination, slow violence, the Anthropocene. So part of a paradigm shift always involves the necessity of creating new concepts, new terms to embrace new ways of thinking. So we've already been talking about ecocriticism, which is the kind of overall term for environmental, literary and cultural studies. I'm currently working in the field of ecopoetics, which focuses specifically on the way that the lyrical use of language can open up ossified ways of speaking and thinking. I'm also very interested in the field of biosemiotics, which relocates human articulate language and writing within a much vaster field of communication, because all living organisms engage in sign relations. Ecosemiotics is a term that's been coined to talk about literature that represents biosemiosis, communication, interaction between living beings, human and non-human, and their environment in a literary way. Zoocriticism focuses on representation of animals in literature and other texts. Material ecocriticism, a very recently coined term, draws upon new developments in physics, in biology and in science studies that are disclosing the dynamic character of matter and materiality, that matter has agency. It's not only humans that have agency. And cultural ecology, it's an important term in German ecocriticism, developed by Hubert Zupf at the University of Augsburg as a way of capturing the role of literature and other works of the creative imagination in renewing culture and renewing human relations to the more than human world. And ecocriticism often also intersects with other interdisciplinary fields other areas of research, such as environmental justice, which focuses on links between social inequality and environmental degradation, the impacts of which tend to fall disproportionately on people who are already disadvantaged, while the benefits of the things that cause those negative effects are enjoyed by the privileged. Trans-species justice is one way of talking about an ethics that recognises non-human as well as human others as worthy of respect and consideration. And we've already had the Anthropocene. How many of you have heard of this concept, incidentally? It's a few people. It's just it's going viral, as they say. Right? So it's actually coined by the chemist Paul Crutzen to refer to the reality that many systems, many Earth systems, have been reshaped by human activities in ways that will be visible in the geological record millennia into the future. If there's anybody there to look at the record, right? Our footprint will be there, big time. And a forthcoming book is an edited collection, Keywords for Environmental Studies, which I'm sure is going to be incredibly useful for everybody entering into this field. So, ecocriticism has also been supported by the creation of new professional organisations such as the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment, the UK-Ireland equivalent, the European equivalent, the Australian equivalent, Australia-New Zealand equivalent, of which I was founding president, I have to say, immodestly. And there are many more around the world today. And these associations also, of course, have their journals, which include Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and Environment, the official organ of ASLI, Green Letters, UK-Ireland, Ecozona, EASLC, the European Association, and the Australasian Journal of Ecocriticism and Cultural Ecology. So what is the importance of this ecological turn? Well, in 2007, a group of researchers from Australia published an article called Mind the Sustainability Gap. And they were talking about the gap between what scientists know that we need to be doing about major environmental challenges, such as climate change or biodiversity loss, and what actually is being done, which is way too little. And although a number of the contributors to this article are themselves natural scientists, they argue that the sciences and technology, while essential to addressing these challenges, are insufficient in themselves. Why? Well, because human action in the world emerges from a complex dialectic among the living world itself, the social contexts of human life and action, and the conceptualizations through which human life is made meaningful. Therefore, fundamentally enhanced collaboration among natural and social scientists and scholars of human contexts, symbols and meanings would signal the beginning of a new paradigm for addressing the sustainability gap. In other words, crossing that disciplinary divide that I talked about at the outset is necessary to close the sustainability gap. So, ecocriticism is now one of a number of humanities disciplines and related disciplines also in some of the social sciences that are coming together, that are being integrated with various of the sciences, ecology, ethology, geology, climatology, etc., various sciences are being integrated in various ways with, for example, environmental history, philosophy, religious studies, literary, visual and cultural studies, ecolinguistics, and also human geography and anthropology, which in a way have always straddled that divide and now kind of linking up with these other new developments in really interesting ways. And this field also intersects with other interdisciplinary areas. I've already mentioned science studies, human animal and human plant studies, gender and queer studies, post-colonial studies, and also Indigenous ecological knowledge and values. So the environmental humanities, or as we called it in Australia in 2000, when a group of us got together to try and create this new monster, this hybrid, we called it the ecological humanities. But it really is becoming not only an interdisciplinary, but in a sense a transdisciplinary field. So I just want to conclude with an extract from the editorial introduction from the first volume of the world's first journal of environmental humanities, which is Australian, Environmental Humanities, although it's just about to be taken over by an American university press. But it has its genesis in the Australian Ecological Humanities. But the editors say here that the environmental humanities engages with fundamental questions of meaning, value, responsibility, and purpose in a time of rapid and escalating change. At the core of this approach is a focus on the underlying cultural and philosophical frameworks that are entangled with the ways in which diverse human cultures have made themselves at home in a more than human world. By more than human world, it's a phrase that's used very widely in ecocriticism and ecophilosophy. We mean simply a world that is co-constructed by plants and animals and, you know, the movement of tectonic plates and the atmosphere and so on and so forth. We live in a world of diverse and entangled agencies, non-human and human together. And that is where I will conclude. Thank you very much.